All summer long, we have been reaching out to the world with our Outcast Christian campaign. July 4th, we kicked off our campaign with an Outcast Christian themed float that we had in a parade. Now think about it. That title itself is provocative. Outcast Christian. An outcast Christian can mean many things to many different people. But during our campaign, we were focusing this statement on those specifically who, for one reason or another, have felt cast out of their church. Imagine living in that paradox. Someone who has a deep spiritual yearning, someone who wants to be part of a faith community, someone who was raised in the church and loves their church, until the day arrives when they realize that even though they love their church, it becomes clear that their church no longer loves them. Imagine being born and raised in a church, now an active adult, actively working in the life of the church on mission trips and on mission teams. And love comes knocking at the door. Plans are being made for that joyous wedding day. It's in this happy time of life when the same minister who baptized you now calls you a sinner and tells you that you're going to hell. In that moment, it becomes crystal clear what it means to be an outcast Christian. Imagine a person who drifts away from the church for any reason, maybe just boredom of the church, not being spiritually fed. But many years later, one has that spiritual longing beginning to tug at the depths of their soul. God's calling is so strong that the fearful journey brings them back into a strange church, beginning that journey of going to somewhere unknown with unknown people. Upon doing that fearful task of entering a new church, quickly the judgmental glances send a clear message. At this church, there is an unwritten dress code. That dress code does not include blue jeans, and certainly it does not include tattoos. If they didn't know what it meant to be an outcast Christian before, in that moment, receiving those judgmental glances, it becomes crystal clear what it means to be an outcast Christian. Imagine a person going through the pains, the heartbreaking pains of divorce. During the most difficult times in our life, where do we go to expect to receive some love and support? We go to our church community. We go to our same church community that's given us warm love, embrace for so many years. Certainly they will provide strength and comfort in this difficult time. But we quickly learned that the warmth and love of that congregation came with conditions. Conditions of living a certain approved life. Conditions of following their strict interpretations of the ancient laws of the Bible. In that moment, it becomes crystal clear what it means to be an outcast Christian. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being cast out of the church by the very minister who baptized you? Cast out by the people you once called your closest friends, and even cast out by your closest relatives? Can you imagine the pain? Can you imagine the spiritual hurt that this must have caused? Can you even imagine? Yeah, I suppose you can. That's why many of you are here today, isn't it? For in one way or another, these are just versions of your own stories, aren't they? If you have felt cast out from your home church, you are not alone. For many of the people in this church have been cast out by their home church. The people sitting around you today know the hurt and pain of being cast out of the church they've known since childhood. But they are not the only ones who can identify with being an outcast Christian. The Bible gives us a story of someone who had a similar experience. Someone who was cast out of their place of worship. A place of worship they knew since childhood. Earlier in the service today, Bobby read our scripture reading, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 16 to 30. As she read, we heard her tell us a familiar story, a story many of us can identify with. Jesus grew up in Nazareth. The synagogue in Nazareth was his home place of worship, a place Jesus once felt loved and welcomed. Until one day, Jesus comes out and proclaims how he identifies himself. The worshiping community he once called his closest friends and family made it very clear that from that day forward, Jesus was no longer welcomed in that place of worship. Jesus the Christ was now officially an outcast. The church often talks about the pain Jesus experienced on the cross, and that's very true, a central part of our theology. But long before the cross, Jesus experienced the pain of rejection. And not just any rejection, the rejection from the faith community that was once his spiritual home. Being an outcast, though, is not limited to just those who have been cast out of their home church. The root of outcast Christians runs much deeper. Outcast Christians refers actually to 80% of the Christian community. Those who call themselves Christian, but rarely, if ever, go to church. Maybe they've never been cast out of a church. Maybe they haven't experienced the hurt and pain that others have experienced. But this large majority of Christians have this innate understanding of what church should be, what church could be. In church after church they've tried, wanting desperately to find that spiritual ideal that we've all been looking for. The spiritual ideal we've all been looking for is so much more than the shallow theology that fits on a bumper sticker. The spiritual ideal is so much more than the hurtful theology that tears people down. The spiritual ideal is more than the fear-mongering Christianity that aims to control and manipulate the masses through the fear of eternal damnation. The spiritual ideal is more than narrow-minded theology that views intellectual thought as a threat. The oppressive dogma of the crumbling institution has created a spiritual prison. Chained and shackled to the pews, Christians sit enslaved to their institutional church. They sit as mindless drones, repeating mundane rituals of the Dark Ages, or they become intoxicated by the bubblegum theology of the 21st century. Thank God we're outcast Christians. Outcast Christian is not an insult. Outcast Christian is not a negative title. If we've been cast out, that means we've been freed. We've been liberated from the institutional prison. In Plato's allegory of the cave, the outcast Christian would be the one who escapes the shadowy semi-existence of the cave and becomes enlightened by their freedom. When we were enslaved by the institutional church, we were blinded by the routine of ritual, blinded by the fear of hell, blinded by the obedience to the institution. And whether we were cast out of the church or we found our own passage to freedom, we became liberated from that spiritual prison of the institutional church. Well, we were liberated until that day when God begins tugging at our heart once again. We were liberated until our spiritual self begins asking those big questions. Who am I? What is my purpose on earth? Where am I going? Where is it all going? We begin to long once again for that wonderful feeling of being part of a faith community. To be with others who are also walking a spiritual journey. To be with others who also want to bring justice to this world. To be with others who are also seeking a spiritual ideal. To be with others who, despite being spiritually hurt in the past, still believe that there can be some good found trapped in the depths of the institutional church. Believe me, hope is alive in the possibilities. We can be a part of the change in the institution. We can be the pioneers who bring about the much-needed second reformation of the church. Right here, right now, the people in this room can change the course of Christianity for generations to come. We are the outcast Christians, but make no mistake about it, outcasts are not the victims. The victims are those who are still trapped in the rotting corpse of a dying institution. The victims are those who are still bound to the pews of religious slavery. The victims are those who are still blinded by the beat of bubblegum theology. No, outcast Christians are not the victims. Outcast Christians are those who have become enlightened and found religious freedom. Outcasts are those who possess the power, passion, and desire to change the world. For was not Rosa Parks an outcast when she refused to move to the back of the bus? Was not Malala an outcast when she spoke out for a woman's right to an education? Was not Temple Grandin an outcast when she spoke out for the humane treatment of animals? Was not Harvey Milk an outcast when he was elected to office? And was not Jesus the Christ an outcast when he died on the cross? Outcasts are not victims. Outcasts are revolutionaries. Outcasts are outcasts because they have the courage to stand up and speak out. Outcasts are outcasts because they are deemed by the power structures to be outside agitators and disturbers of the peace. Outcasts are outcasts because outcasts will no longer sit quietly in the pews and take the religious abuse of a hurtful institution. Outcast Christians love God, they love Jesus, and they love the Bible. But outcast Christians want desperately to be part of a faith community that's found in a church. But we believe the church can be so much more than it's become. As outcast Christians, we are not the victims. We are the transformative voice that will bring about the Second Reformation. We will make an impact on our own lives as we make an impact in the lives of others. We will transform the hearts, minds, and souls as we transform this church. We are the outcast Christians, and together we will change the world.